Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
I see Dealey Plaza like a kind of Lowry painting of there's all these individual characters. But what really interested me was that these people have chosen to avoid the main event of Kennedy and Main Street. But then what happens if you opt out of that main event, but you then become part of the most studied 6 seconds in the 20th century?
Dallas, 22nd of November 1963. The main event is supposed to be on the appropriately named Main Street. News footage shows office workers leaning out of windows peering at a motorcade through a blizzard of ticker tape. On the sidewalks, the crowds are 50 deep. A wall of noise and celebration. Everybody thinks this is the place to be. Well, nearly everyone. A few blocks away in Dealey Plaza, the scene is different. There is no ticker tape here and the crowds are thin. A dressmaker with vertigo films the action balanced on a concrete plinth. A man is opening an umbrella even though it isn't raining. A construction worker will claim he was sent here by God, and 3 mysterious tramps will shortly be arrested. I speak with Martin Fitzgerald, who has written a new book, The Umbrella Man and Other Stories. This is a book about memory, how we construct our shared history, and what happens when your life is defined by a single fleeting moment. It's a celebration of human nature, the joy of research, and the freedom of an open mind. Above all, it reveals the stories of a group of real people who thought that they had opted out of the main event only to find themselves at the centre of the most scrutinised 6 seconds of the 20th century. I'm delighted to welcome Martin Fitzgerald to our Cold War conversation.
It dates back to a history lesson when I was at school in southeast London, aged 14. And up to that point, history lessons involved the teacher reading out facts and the pupils writing them down to learn them. Until one day the teacher came in and said, right, we're going to do a class on the JFK Assassination. I don't really know if anyone in the class even knew who JFK was, but the teacher explained the basic facts that he was the president of the United States. He got shot on November 22nd, 1963. There's a man called Lee Harvey Oswald who was arrested approximately 90 minutes later, and then Lee Harvey Oswald was killed live on TV in police custody 2 days later. The subsequent investigation into these events concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone and that there was no conspiracy in the assassination of the president. But then there was a subsequent investigation in 1978 called the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which concluded that in all likelihood there probably was a conspiracy. So the teacher laid out those facts, and then he went through a few of the theories relating to the CIA, the Mafia, the FBI, and then he handed out a map. And I remember seeing this map like it was yesterday. One of the things I love about this subject is it has its own lexicon. Okay, so there was a grassy knoll, which were 2 words I'd never seen put together before. There was a triple underpass, which to this day I only know in the context of the JFK assassination. Then, of course, there was the Texas School Book Depository. And, a funny thing is if you Google the Minnesota School Book Depository or the California School Book Depository, do you know what comes up first? The Texas School Book Depository, because it's the only school book depository. So it had its own language. And by the way, I've never met anyone called Zapruder either. So it wasn't just the geography; it was the witnesses had these, and I was sort of fascinated by it. And then as a class, we kicked around some theories for 20 minutes, and then the teacher came back and he said, "Right, what do you think? What do you think happened?" And I immediately looked to a pupil called Juliet Fuller. She was always top of the class. She always knew everything, and she put her hand up and she said, "It may have been the CIA." And the teacher looked at her and he said, "Anyone else?" Now, Juliet Fuller had never heard anyone else. Juliet Fuller had only ever heard correct answer. So a bunch of other kids felt licensed to just put their hands up as well. And for a classroom that had never heard of Kennedy an hour ago, we were suddenly implicating everyone in his murder: Cubans, Russians, uh, the FBI, the CIA. And then at the end, we looked to the teacher and said, well, what's the answer? And he said, well, I don't really know either. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. That's cool. I like that. It was more interesting than the dissolution of the monasteries, which is which I'm not saying that's not an interesting subject, but I like the fact it was open-ended. And then after that, it was just a series of coincidences that in 1988, so a few years later, it was the 25th anniversary of the assassination, which was a big anniversary, the first big anniversary of the assassination. There was lots of documentaries on the telly. The Men Who Killed Kennedy aired for the first time. Another key factor, Ian, which is strange for a JFK researcher, is that some of my favourite bands were writing songs about the assassination. So bands like The Wedding Present and The Fall, who are two English bands. And I thought, okay, this subject's may be cool because I love these bands and they're writing songs about the assassination. And then, of course, in 1991, Oliver Stone released JFK, which is it's a somewhat flawed film, but it's an incredible piece of cinema. And I remember going to see it. And I mean, people talk about how many shots there were in Dealey Plaza. There's 1,600 shots in that film. That film is edited. It's incredibly well. It moves so quickly. I remember walking out the cinema, just sort of mouth open, going to the nearest Wimpy, getting some food and just going back to the cinema. And then since then, I've just always had an interest in it. I started to read books. I eventually went to Dallas. And it's never left me. And despite the fact that I think now it is, sometimes you mention this subject and people roll their eyes, and I understand that because the subject has been somewhat hijacked by extremists and people on message boards that only communicate with caps on. But I like I think it's such a rich story. I think it's comparable to the history of the Beatles in terms of its richness. And to just argue about who did it would be like, in the case of the Beatles, just talking about who was the best, Paul or John. So as I learned more about the subject, and as I travelled to Dallas more, I started to find stories that were underappreciated and often not told, which is why I thought I'd write a book, Ian.
Well, that was going to be my question as to why you thought that another JFK book is needed when there must be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands out there.
40,000. There's 40,000 books on the assassination, and there's an entire library in Washington, D.C., which just has JFK assassination books. And you're not alone asking this question, Ian. In fact, it was the first question my publisher asked. So I told them what I'm now going to tell your listeners, which is I believe I have a different angle to this story. And my angle is this. On the 22nd of November, 1963, the main event that day was supposed to happen in Main Street in Dallas. So Kennedy was coming to Dallas to shore up the Democrat vote, but also to kind of unite the warring factions in the Texas Democratic Party. And the central part of his day, as far as the public were concerned, was going to be him in his motorcade driving down Main Street. And if you look at the footage and the photographs of Kennedy in Main Street, you really get a sense that this was the place to be. So the sidewalks are 60, 70 deep. There's people hanging out of windows, looking through a blizzard of ticker tape. All of the professional news broadcasters are in Main Street. All of the best photographers are in Main Street. So if Main Street is the party, then Dealey Plaza is the kitchen. And Ian, we all know what sort of people end up in the kitchen at parties. The most interesting, I would say. So I started to look at Dealey Plaza, and I thought, and it's just a few blocks away from Main Street. And when you look at Dealey Plaza, well, the sidewalks aren't 50, 60 deep. They're in places 1 deep, but in other places you can just walk up to the curb. There aren't any professional broadcasters there. There's a dressmaker with vertigo called Abraham Zapruder, and he's standing on a 4-foot plinth, being held by his secretary so that he doesn't fall over. And he's going to become our documentarian for this event. To his left, there's a man on the curb, and he's going to open up an umbrella on an otherwise sunny day. He's the only man in Dealey Plaza with an open umbrella. And as soon as he opens it, Kennedy gets shot. Following him round, there's a construction worker with an aluminium helmet on, and he's sitting outside a building called the Texas School Book Depository. And he's going to look up just before the assassination, and he's going to see something. And what he sees is going to become the official story. But he's going to tell everyone for the rest of his life that he was sent there by God in order to see this, and so on and so on. So I see Dealey Plaza like a kind of Lowry painting of there's all these individual characters, and some of them have had a huge impact on the assassination. Some of them have been hugely affected by the assassination. But what really interested me was when you read their testimonies, the fact that they were in Dealey Plaza is not just situational. They often made that decision because they didn't want to go to the main event. And I'm that sort of person, Ian, right? So that if I'm at a festival and everyone's going to, the pyramid stage at Glastonbury, sometimes there's a trickle of people going in a different direction, going somewhere else. Sometimes you might go to the, Louvre in Paris, but you might not be there to see the Mona Lisa where everyone else is. So I started to think, well, hang on a sec, this is a personality trait that these people have chosen to avoid the main event. So then what happens if you opt out of that main event, but you then become part of the most studied 6 seconds in the 20th century? And that was my angle, really, was that these people, in a kind of world, obviously without mobile phones and anything like that, it was these people which shaped our understanding of the assassination. And I was fascinated by that, and I was fascinated by their stories. And I wanted to give these witnesses more than just those 6 seconds. I wanted to tell their almost their whole lives, but really focus on what impact this event had on them.
That's one of the many things that I really enjoyed about this book is you're looking at these ordinary citizens and how they come to be there for this incredible event and how it changes their lives forever because they're on the scene.
Yeah, and I should also say the other thing that I wanted to do, I mean, having read lots and lots of books on this subject, I've sometimes been left with the feeling that I've been cornered, by a lunatic in a pub, and I wanted to write something which gave the reader the sense that they were in the company of a friend. So I was trying to give some air to this subject. So I'm completely agnostic on the topic of who did it. If you want to read a book about the JFK assassination and find out whether it was Lee Harvey Oswald or whether it was a conspiracy, this is not the book for you. I do touch on some of that stuff, but I have seen myself people become, and also this subject has been sort of lumped in with things like 9/11 conspiracy theories, moon landings, QAnon. And to me, it's not like that at all. This is just a cold case that never went to trial. And so I wanted to give the subject some air by focusing not on those thorny topics that become so argumentative, and focus instead on these stories and, in some cases, these puzzles. Why did a man open up an umbrella on a sunny day just as Kennedy got shot. A 10-year-old would want to solve that. And you don't need to have any prior knowledge of the assassination. You don't need to know about Kennedy's foreign policy. You just really, it's such a tantalizing puzzle that I wanted to focus on things like that. And I also wanted the book to be, there is some emotion in the book. Obviously, it's a tragic event, but the book is also fun. And I sort of wanted to make it accessible to people. That, I mean, I almost called it everything you wanted to know about the JFK assassination, but were afraid to ask. And it is that it's a book that is accessible and it's fun to read. As I say, I don't think at the end of it you will feel like you've been cornered by a lunatic in a pub. Although you might,
not.
maybe you will.
I doubt it very much. I mean, I think one of the reasons I really enjoy is it's very much sort of in the frame of how I like to record my Cold War conversations interviews. Is it's about not who done it, but what that experience was like being there, how they felt, and as I said before, how it's impacted them in future life. And the book is titled The Umbrella Man and Other Stories. So can we start with The Umbrella Man? Because he's, if anybody's familiar with the JFK assassination, he is probably the most famous person of interest that people have focused in on.
Yes. So the Umbrella Man story is very, very simple. As I say, that as Kennedy's motorcade goes past the book depository, comes towards Elm Street, he's got the triple under. He's 100 yards away from the triple underpass, and then he's going to be on the freeway heading to the trademark to do his speech. So this really is the end of the motorcade. It's the exit is almost marked out in front of him. And on the north curb of Elm Street, a man opens up an umbrella. And as he does that, Kennedy gets shot. And as I say, it's not raining. So where the Umbrella Man becomes interesting, and you often find this in a lot of these stories, Ian, is these stories tell us more about us than they do about the individual involved. So when the Warren Commission concluded its investigation into the assassination in 1964, which ran for 16,000 pages and interviewed hundreds of witnesses, there was no mention of this man with an umbrella. Even though he's visible in a Zapruder film, even though there were photographs of him that were published in the papers on the day, there was no mention of the Umbrella Man. And of course, this led to, people wondering why. People looking at that photo and thinking, well, this doesn't make sense. It looks, on the one hand, like a very benign image, but surely it can't be a coincidence that this man has opened up an umbrella at the time when Kennedy got shot. So, of course, people naturally started to come up with their own theories. And those theories, if you're listening to this, you may have already developed. So the most obvious that people always say to me when I tell this story is that, well, surely he was providing a signal, that he was part of the ground team on the assassination, and he was providing a signal for multiple assassins to start shooting. And then another theory was that the umbrella itself contained a poison dart, which the idea was to I mean, you laugh at it, but this dart was designed to immobilize Kennedy, so that the shooters could then kill him. When you analyse both of those theories, which, I mean, the first one in particular, the signal one, is perfectly understandable. But when you analyse them, they really do fall apart just under the merest scrutiny, because if the umbrella was a signal, well, how effective would that signal have been if it was raining that day? as it was on the morning of the 22nd of November 1963. And also, I just can't imagine the recruitment of that man, where the man says, so let me get this straight. You want me to stand near a limousine, open up an umbrella, and then as I do that, everyone's going to start shooting from multiple directions. No, thank you. But in it, look, in the absence of any other theory, it was a theory. And then this speculation reached its peak in 1967, where John Updike, the Pulitzer Prize winning author, started to write about the Umbrella Man in the New Yorker in his column, "The Talk of the Town." And I'm going to read out what John Updike says, because this quote is so perfect in terms of what I'm trying to do with this book. Updike says, "We wonder whether a genuine mystery is being concealed here, or whether any similar scrutiny of a minute section of time and space would yield similar strangeness, gaps, inconsistencies, warps, and bubbles in the surface of circumstance." Which is a beautiful quote, and the sense of, if you put anything under the microscope, then perhaps you might see these strange things. The story then took a twist in the mid-70s during a church committee, where a former head of the CIA, I forget his name temporarily, testified to the church committee, which was a committee about really overreach by the intelligence services. And he admitted that in 1963, the CIA were developing poison darts, and they were using umbrellas as a form of delivering that dart. I still think, as a theory, it's like, I would never understand why, trained assassins looking through, telescopic scopes would ever give the first shot to a man with an umbrella and a dart. And also, frankly, if you want to immobilize someone, that's what the high-powered rifles are for. But this testimony to the church committee really did give this theory some credence. In 1975, the American public saw the Zapruder film for the first time. They saw Kennedy's head go back into the left. There was a general unease amongst the American public that they'd been lied to, that things had been covered up. So a new investigation was put together, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and its aim was to fill in all of the gaps from the original investigation. And of course, one of those gaps was the Umbrella Man. But it was through that investigation that the Umbrella Man finally came forward, 15 years after the event, and he told his story.
And if you want to hear his story, you're going to have to buy the book.
I can guarantee your listeners one thing: they will never guess it. They will never guess what he has to say. But students of the Cold War, I would say, Ian, are going to have more chance of believing him than other people. I believe his story. But the fascinating thing about him is that, what it tells about, as I said earlier, what it says about us, our desire to make sense of things. There's a similar incident recently where there was a heist at the Louvre. I don't know if you remember that. I think it was the end of last year. And there was a young French guy dressed as a Victorian detective that was in some of the photos. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do.
There was a day or so of people saying, well, hang on a minute, what's going on here? And I think they located him. And it turned out he's just a teenager who just enjoyed dressing like that. The Umbrella Man has a much more interesting ending. And it was 15 years that people had to sort of wait for it. But the fascinating thing about the Umbrella Man is that in those 15 years between 63 and 78, He had no idea he was a person of interest, right? So he just went back to work that day with his umbrella. He never read any books on the assassination. He never studied the Warren Commission. He didn't know that he was the talk of the town in the talk of the town in the New Yorker. He had no idea. And actually, when he saw the advert in the papers asking him to come forward, he just put it in the bin. It was only because one of his work colleagues phoned up the number and said, "I know this guy. This is what his name is, and this is where he works." And within an hour, there was a bunch of journalists at his work, and they all said the same thing: "Are you the Umbrella Man?" So he's like the guy on the cover of Abbey Road by the Beatles. I don't know if you know, but there's a tourist from Florida who's in the background of the cover of Abbey Road. He had no idea he was on the cover of Abbey Road until his wife, who was a piano teacher, bought the album so she could teach her students some of the songs. And he looked at it and he said, "Hang on a minute, that's me. That's me." So, people think that these witnesses, and in many cases it did define their lives. And there were suddenly a lot of potential authors in Dealey Plaza. Just by being, there's a lot of books written by this fairly sparse crowd. A lot of these people have got Wikipedia pages. But there are some people like the Umbrella Man that just went back to work. And he was not a student of the assassination at all. So for 15 years, he was completely oblivious to everything.
It's incredible, being involved in an event like that and not wanting to know more about it. But then I guess my level of curiosity is somewhat different to most other people's.
Yeah, and look, I mean, every facet of human nature is in Dealey Plaza, which is one of the points of the book, really, which is that you can't treat all of these people the same. There are people in Dealey Plaza that themselves became amateur detectives on this case. But there are some people, and when you get to know the Umbrella Man's story, it makes sense because he wasn't particularly into politics. He didn't even like Kennedy, right? So he was just there at an event, and he did something that he was probably embarrassed about, and then he got on with his life. And this is the days before the internet, obviously. So he just didn't read the books that all of the people that weren't at the event did. And it's those people that can't understand his actions because they're fascinated by the subject, and they can't understand why someone who was there doesn't have that fascination at all, and just almost compartmentalized it in his mind for 15 years.
I mean, probably the most famous witness who's there, and we've mentioned him already in this chat, is Abraham Zapruder, who filmed the Color Cine film, which is now iconic as far as the documenting exactly what happened there. But I found it fascinating that he'd actually left his camera at home that day, and his secretary, I think, encouraged him to go back and get it.
So he's a classic example of this personality trait which I'm talking about, which is that the people that can't be bothered with the main event and the crowds. So he was a really enthusiastic, sort of amateur filmmaker. Everyone knew that about him. And he also owned a dress manufacturer called Jennifer Junior's. And his office was in Dealey Plaza in a building called the Dal-Tex building, short for Dallas Textiles. And that's right next door to the Texas School Book Depository. So Abraham Zapruder knew that Kennedy was going to be passing by his office that day. But as he woke up in the morning, he just thought, I'll have to jostle for position. And he just thought, I can't be bothered. I can't be bothered. So he goes to work, and during a coffee break at around 10 o'clock, I think, maybe 2.5 hours before Kennedy's due, he gets he gets, harangued by a bunch of his own employees. And they all say, Abe, go and get your camera. We know how much you love taking films. And he keeps on demurring and saying no. And they're like, Abe, just do it. Go and get your camera. And then about an hour later, they can't find him. Because he has gone to get his camera. And he's now, driving back to downtown Dallas. On the passenger seat of his car is the Bell & Howell Zoomatic camera. It has no electricity. It has no batteries. The only power it gets is from the user winding it up. And there are 26 seconds of film left on this camera, and that's on the passenger seat. Meanwhile, in his office, his assistant Lillian Rogers gets on the loudspeaker and says to the entire workforce at Jennifer Juniors, the president is due in an hour. I don't care what your politics are, whether you like him or not. You are going to take an extended lunch break and you are going to go out and you're going to go and see the president. Now, one of the employees that takes advantage of this is a receptionist called Marilyn Sitzman. Not because she wants to see Kennedy, though. She has this idea. She thinks, great, I'm going to use this opportunity to go and open a bank account. Because Marilyn Sitzman didn't have a bank account. They got paid in cash back then. And she was not a fan of Kennedy, like a lot of Dallas. I mean, Dallas was the city that Kennedy lost by the biggest margin in the 1960 election. So Marilyn Sitzman thinks, I'm going to go and open a bank account. Meanwhile, Zapruder comes back to his office with his camera, and the only person there is his assistant, Lillian Rogers, because she sent everyone off. And the first thing Zapruder says is, okay, well, I better mind the place, because he was the boss. He said, I better look after this. And he gives the camera to Lillian Rogers. And he says, I tell you what, you go and film it. And Lillian she's like, I don't know how it works, Abe. You go and do it. And they prevaricate for a bit. And in the end, Lillian Rogers basically pushes him out the door and says, you go and film the motorcade. I'll look after the offices. And then Abraham Zapruder is on the north curb of Elm Street. He's very near the Umbrella Man, actually. He's between the grassy knoll and the Texas School Book Depository. And he takes a couple of test shots of some of his employees, but he's looking for a vantage point. He's looking for somewhere to take this film. Meanwhile, who walks up? Marilyn Sitzman, the receptionist that had gone to open a bank account. What happened? All the banks in Dallas are closed. And she says to Abraham Zapruder, what are you doing? And he says, I'm trying to find a place to film this motorcade. Marilyn Sitzman looks around, and on a raised bit of grass behind her on the north curb of Elm Street, there is a white 4-foot concrete plinth, which is still there today. And she points at it and she says to Abraham Zapruder, well, what about there? And he says, well, I've got vertigo. She says, it's fine. I'll stand behind you and I'll hold you. Which you would never get away with these days, Ian. I mean, HR would be all over that. But back in '63, it was fine. So the two of them climb up onto this 4-foot plinth, which is very difficult to get onto. I mean, I've tried to do it as a much younger man than Abraham Zapruder, not wearing a suit. It's not easy. But they get up there, and of course now he has a view, over the small crowd, and and then he sees a motorcycle and he starts his camera, and he quickly realizes that the motorcycle is just an outrider. So he presses stop, and then he sees two more motorcycles coming through, and he sees a car, and he says to himself, okay, let's go. And then he presses play, starts shooting, and he's the only person that captured the assassination from start to finish. And if you look at the film, and I'm sure everyone listening to this has seen it, but it's always worth going back and looking at it again. What you're struck by is how steady he was, how he never flinched, how he caught everything. And he was asked in later life, how did you do that? because he's watching all of this through a zoom lens, and he would say himself that he didn't know how he did that. But he was the first witness to really, really appreciate that Kennedy had died. And he got down from that plinth and he told anyone that would listen that Kennedy's head exploded. It was horrific. And his story again there's so much kind of breadth to his story. This wasn't the first murder he'd ever seen. He was an immigrant from Ukraine, and when the Zapruder family fled, the camps in Eastern Europe, I think when they got to Poland, they took his brother off a train and killed him in front of him. And then his story after the assassination is a story of such sort of dedication to his family and to trying to do the right thing, but also just how haunted he was by what he saw and what he captured. And on the night of the assassination, he has a terrible nightmare where he's walking down Broadway in New York, and there's a kind of huckster on the street saying, roll up, come and see the president's head, get blown up. And he wakes up the next morning and he becomes resigned to selling this film so that he has no responsibility for it anymore. As you know, through doing these podcasts, Ian, history doesn't choose its witnesses or its documentarians. But in Abraham Zapruder, you couldn't have chosen someone better in terms of the way he preserved that film, the way he was sensitive towards the family. The first bit of money he got for the film, he gave it to the widow of J.D. Tippit, who was the policeman that got killed in Oak Cliff just after the assassination. And it's become, it is the kind of Bayeux tapestry of the assassination. And it's symbolic of the time it was shot in. You look at it and it's got the sprocket holes. Nowadays there'd be thousands of images, but he was the only one that did it, and he was the most reluctant witness you can imagine. He's the embodiment of psychology trait that I'm talking about, of someone that didn't want to insert himself in the story, that didn't want to compete with other people. So he left his camera at home, and then 5 hours later.
I think what we forget is this isn't video as well. This is film. So he has to go and get that developed.
Well, that's the amazing thing. So quickly, the word spreads around Dealey Plaza that there's a guy that might have filmed it all, and he gets approached by the Secret Service. And first he gets approached by a journalist who is offered him money. And Zapruder says, no, I'm not interested in that. This needs to go to the proper authorities, which, again, you have to give him credit for. So he talks to a Secret Service guy. Secret Service guy phones up the Kodak lab at Love Field, the airport. And the guys at Kodak are like, look, we're just wrapping up. We're thinking of going home. Secret Service guy says, you're not going anywhere, right? You'll need to stay there. Keep the doors open. We'll be there in an hour. We have a film you need to develop. So they all drive to Love Field, and as they approach the Kodak lab, again, it's one of the just remarkable coincidences. As they approach the Kodak lab, Air Force One is taking off with Kennedy's body in a coffin and a new president being sworn in. It happens almost simultaneously. And then they go into Kodak and they give them this film. And I don't know if you remember, Ian, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners will remember the days where when you went on holiday and you took films that you then came back and you had to get them developed, and you were never quite sure whether they were any good or not, and you thought, I really hope that picture I got, outside, whatever, really was really good. But you never know, and you're slightly anxious. Well, this is like that, but times 1,000, because they don't really know what he's got. And they run it through the projector, and the first thing on the film is just a couple of kids in a garden playing. They're Zapruder's grandchildren. And he says, "Oh, sorry, I've completely forgot about that." And then they show the film, and there's complete silence, as you could imagine. This is an hour or two after the assassination, and at the end of it, one of the Secret Service guys just says, "Oh my God." Now, the remarkable thing is that the US government then don't take ownership of the film. So there's 3 copies created, one for the FBI, I think, one for the Secret Service, a copy for Abraham Zapruder, and he also gets to keep the in-camera original. So they've got what they've wanted. And Abraham Zapruder drives home again. The Bell and Howell camera is on the passenger seat with a copy of the film, and he gets home, and his wife greets him at the door, and she just says, "Oh, Abe," because she knows what's happened. And Abraham Zapruder walks past her, and he goes into his basement, and he sets up his projector, and he just spends all evening watching it. I mean, it's incredible. When you think about it, it's incredible. And then the story of how that film was commercialized is, again, incredible. The story is that everyone tried to rip him off. Everyone thought he's just this immigrant guy. He's a dressmaker, So these people at Life magazine and in, later years, the American government, they've all tried to rip off the Zapruder family, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. As I say, it wasn't the first murder he'd ever witnessed. He's the great American immigrant story. He came from Eastern Europe, worked in the, garment district in Brooklyn. He has this fantastic phrase about dressmaking, which I love, which is, a dress is easy. You just need a front and a back and a couple of sleeves, and that's the kind of guy we're talking with. It's the kind of guy we're talking about. And so, Life magazine tried to rip him off, and he got double the amount of money that they were authorized to offer him at first. In the end, in the early 90s, obviously Abraham Zapruder has been long since dead. The American government end up paying the Zapruder family, I think it's $16 million to own the film, because they wanted to own it as an assassination record. And that went to arbitration. So he's just, I think he's a real hero, Abraham Zapruder. Some people have criticised the family for making money off it, but actually, there's another way of looking at that story, which is, as I've said, people tried to rip him off, and he was too smart for them. To me, he's a great American hero, and what would our understanding of that event be, Ian, without his film? And even if that film, wasn't as good as what it was, it's such a clear view of that assassination that it shaped our understanding of it.
Yeah. If he hadn't shot that film, there's probably be 100,000 books on the assassination. Yeah,
and when you look at the film again, you can see the umbrella. You can see the umbrella at the Stemmons, freeway sign. In the distance, you can see the construction worker with a shiny aluminium helmet sitting opposite the Texas School Book Depository. The only person who's not in his film, of course, is Lee Harvey Oswald, but he captures everything. It was the bedrock of the investigation.
Whilst his is the only cinematic record of the assassination, there are loads of still pictures, and there are characters in those which do create various theories out there. But I think one of the things that I found really interesting in the book is there's a number of black people who are on Dealey Plaza, and they never come in to give a witness statement or anything like that. And I think what I found fascinating, and which I already knew, was about the situation for black people in the South of the US at that point, around racial prejudice and the Jim Crow system.
So one of the things that happens with the assassination a lot is that people look at photographs or they look at the Zapruder film, and people say, well, I wouldn't have acted like that. Therefore, something strange is going on. And in the case of some of the black witnesses, the most famous one is a guy with a black cap who was sitting next to Umbrella Man after the assassination. And he had his hand in the air at the time that the Umbrella Man opened his umbrella. And people have thought that these two are together because they sit next to each other after the assassination. And again, they think his hand in the air is a signal. And in some photos, they think that he is talking into a sort of portable radio. And this guy has never come forward. We do not know who this guy is. And of course, people find that suspicious. And the JFK research community is overwhelmingly male and overwhelmingly white. So when they say things like, well, he looks pretty calm, sitting on the curb afterwards, sitting next to Umbrella Man, he looks pretty calm. And it's kind of weird that he never came forward. Well, put yourself in the shoes of a black man in Dallas in 1963. This was a city that, at the turn of the century, a third of all eligible men, a third, were members of the Klan. And the district attorney in 1963, a guy called Henry Wade, who was the famous Wade in, Roe versus Wade, the famous abortion case. He was the guy that would have prosecuted Lee Harvey Oswald. He said in 1963 that he didn't want any blacks, Mexicans, Jews, Hispanics, or Irish on any jury in Dallas. Right? So, and of course, you've got the whole Jim Crow system of segregation there. So there are actually lots of examples, and I go through them in the book, of other black witnesses that never came forward. There was a young couple who were on the grassy knoll who were 16, 17. They were seen by Marilyn Sitzman, the woman holding Abraham Zapruder. She was very near them. And as soon as the shots happened, they just ran. They're probably still alive, Ian. They're only 16, 17 at the time. But if you were black in Dallas and there were shots being fired and there were police, you got out of there. And when you look at some of the black witnesses that were questioned, particularly the guys in the Texas School Book Depository that were identified in the photos as employees, so they had no choice but to come forward. When you look at the way that they were questioned, they were all asked the same thing. Have you been in trouble with the law before? Now, none of the white witnesses were asked that. So, again, to understand the assassination and to understand some of the people involved in it, you have to understand the sort of geography of Dallas and the politics of Dallas. And it's no good people like me saying, well, I wouldn't have acted like that. Because I'm not a black man in Dallas in 1963. And what you often get is people looking at photographs. It's a constant theme in the book of whether it's the babushka lady, whether it's the black guy with a cap on, whether it's Umbrella Man. People say these people look suspiciously calm, and they forget that there's someone on the other side of that camera, a photographer, who is also calm because they're taking a photograph in the middle of an assassination. But it's this thing about zooming in too much. And the final thing about the guy with the black cap is I always call him the Black Cap Man, but people listening to this may know him as another name. So he's been called in assassination research for years. He's been called the dark-complected man, which is
unbelievable.
Still to this day, this man is called the dark-complected man. So the only thing that you used to identify him was the colour of his skin. And people wonder why he never came forward. I would venture it could be because he's a black man in Dallas, and the way that we've identified him is to draw attention to the colour of his skin. I could be wrong. He could be part of the ground team. I'm just like everyone else, thinking out loud. But I think what I offer in the book is some corroboration with other African American witnesses that also didn't come forward, just to try and say, look, I think there is a theme here, and we need to think about this sort of stuff, because it's not as easy as just looking at fate. There's another chapter in the book about the three tramps. So people may be aware that there were three tramps arrested in Dealey Plaza just after the assassination, and they were paraded through the plaza by some policemen. And again, people looked at these photos and they thought, well, they don't look like tramps. You know, particularly two of them. They've got crisp collars, they've got new shoes, they're freshly shaved. So then they become suspects as well. And if you watch the Oliver Stone film JFK, he basically pins the assassination on these tramps. And to give the researchers some sort of benefit of the doubt here, what makes the tramp story interesting is, well, okay, they got arrested, so we must know who they are. But actually, when people went to the Dallas police to find their arrest records, they'd vanished. So again, it creates suspicion. You've got tramps who don't look like tramps. You've got arrest records that have been vanished. And again, that mystery wasn't solved until the early 90s. That dragged on and on and on, and it's the same thing. People looking at things and thinking that's strange. And sometimes that's a good thing to do. If you look at the Boston Marathon, where there was the bomb, the reason why they caught the Boston Marathon bombers was because they looked at CCTV, and when the bomb went off, everyone in the crowd was looking in one direction, apart from one guy that was looking in another direction. And the FBI followed this guy through CCTV, and he turned out to be one of the bombers. So I'm not saying it's not a legitimate thing to do. I'm just saying it's not always conclusive.
Particularly from a still photo. You know, how do you know what the intentions of that person are? I mean, if I've just seen somebody shot in front of me, I'd be sitting down in shock, trying to take in what was going on, what had just happened.
Yeah, we would all be doing different things. And one of my favourite photos of the assassination, which is on the cover of the book actually, is it's taken 90 seconds after the assassination. There's a policeman on a motorcycle speeding down Elm Street, heading to the Triple Underpass. On the north curb of Elm Street, there's a young couple called Bill and Gail Newman, and they are shielding their children, who are 4 years old and 2 years old. They are covering them on a bank of grass, terrified. But next to them are three photographers. It almost looks stage deal, right? Because you've got two people covering their children, terrified. But you have three photographers who have got the wherewithal to think, I need to capture this. And then next to them, sitting on the curb, is the umbrella man and the black cap man. And that's why I chose that photo for the cover of the book, because I think it covers everything. If you only look at the photo of the Newmans that those photographers took, it looks like a terrifying situation. It's a mum and a dad yet laying on top of young children. But if you zoom out, you see three men in their 20s and 30s who are just calmly taking photographs. And people react differently because people have different jobs to do. So, the journalist that came up with the name The Grass You Know, a guy called Merriman Smith, who christened it, I think at 12:32, 2 minutes after the assassination. He was in a car behind Kennedy, but he was on the phone to his central office, describing what happened. People do different things because they've got different responsibilities, and people react differently to events. You've just said that if you saw someone shot, you would sit on the curb in a complete state of shock. That's what the umbrella man said he did. But other people that weren't there look at that and they say, well, he looks suspiciously calm.
Shock and calm can look the same, yeah.
I know. And it's the problem with one of the phrases I use a lot in the book is this idea of zooming in. And it is that, it goes back to that John Updike quote that if you zoom in on any event, you will see things that the observer may think is strange.
You've been to Dallas a number of times and you've met some of the people that have been there. Now, they must have been questioned hundreds and hundreds of times about their experiences. What new did you find from them, or how did you approach speaking to them that wasn't something that had been asked 100 times before?
So there's a witness in the book called Dr. Tony Glover. She was 11 years old during the assassination. So she's one of the last few, surviving witnesses. And, she's done over 1,000 interviews. When I first got in touch with her to be interviewed for the book, I was very clear. I said, look, I promise you one thing. I'll never ask you how many shots there were, from what direction, over what time span, and I'll never ask you who you think did it. And she replied within 10 minutes and said, what time do you want to talk? And I got a lovely story out of Tony about what she was doing in Dealey Plaza that day, what she was hoping to achieve. Again, she's part of this personality trait that I'm talking about, of not wanting to go to Main Street. She wanted to achieve something in Dealey Plaza. She wanted to be seen by Kennedy. And I asked her at the end of my interview, okay, so, knowing everything that you know now and the trauma that you suffered after seeing what you saw, if you had the opportunity to go back to the morning of 22nd November 1963, I said, where would you go? Dealey Plaza or Main Street? And before I could finish saying Main Street, she said, Dealey Plaza, of course. You couldn't see anything on Main Street. So I got a really lovely story from Tony. Then I went to Dallas to meet Tony. And she features in 2 or 3 chapters in the book. We go on a little bit of a it becomes a little bit of a road movie. We go and visit some of the assassination sites. We go to Oswald's grave. We go to Texas Theater where Oswald got arrested. We go to his rooming house where we meet Pat Hall, who is the granddaughter of the woman who owned the rooming house in 1963, and she knew Lee Harvey Oswald. He used to stay there under the alias O.H. Lee, and during our time with Pat, she only ever referred to Lee Harvey Oswald as Mr. Lee. She still calls him that. We went to Ruth Payne's house out in Irving, which was the place where Oswald spent the last night of the assassination, and where many people believe that he got the rifle from the garage. And she's an incredible woman. She's been through an entire life of ups and downs and comebacks, and to have her life reduced to just those 6 seconds, I think is an utter crime. And then I interviewed her in Dallas at a conference just a few months ago, and we went through her story. And then during a Q&A, a bunch of hands went up, and it was the same thing. How many shots did you hear? Did you see the limousine stop? Did you see anything strange in Lyndon Johnson's card that would lead you to believe that he knew what was going to happen? And look, I understand that, because you've got a bunch of researchers that are trying to solve the crime, and she's a witness. Those people want to see and hear Dealey Plaza through her. They want to vicariously time travel through her memory. But as Tony says, it's like, I was 11 years old and this was 63 years ago. I can barely remember. I can remember being there. I can remember some things clearly. But in terms of number of shots and stuff like that, I just don't know. And also, the other thing with this event is it's one of the most written about, events in history. It would be impossible for any witness to disentangle their own memory of it from what's happened since. So I take a very clear view with witnesses, which is that I try not to ask them the same questions that they've always been asked. And I've met a few times a guy called Buell Wesley Fraser. He was the guy that drove Oswald to work that day. He was a guy that saw a package on the back seat, a long package wrapped in a bag. And he said to Oswald, what's in the package, Lee? And he said that they were some curtain rods. Of course, they never found any curtain rods in the Texas School Book Depository, but they did find a rifle. And I've met Buell a couple of times, and he doesn't want to talk about it too much. I don't want to talk about it too much because just out of respect for him. But we talk about other things, what it's like to live in Dallas now, and everything else. And again, just as I'm trying to give this subject some air and some light in the book, in my interactions with, witnesses or, people that work in the sixth floor museum, I'm trying not to be that guy that just, takes them back to that day and just asks those same questions. I'm very respectful of people giving me time. And there's a strange thing in the book where people in Dallas kept telling me their favorite band, because I tried to talk to them about other things. And actually, what you find, Ian, is when you're generous like that, then actually people tell you things that you would never have got if you were much more direct. So in the book, I go and see an archivist in Dallas. He isn't an archivist. He's the city archivist. And he's got a vault full of all sorts of goodies. And we had a wonderful chat. And he kept telling me how much he loved the Zombies, the 60s band from St. Albans. Talked about 20 minutes about the Zombies. It was great, though, because we were forging a relationship. And then when I went to see a guy called Stephen Fagan, who runs a sixth floor museum in the old Texas School Book Depository, he was telling me how much he loves the Cranberries, about how sad he was when the singer died, and then in the middle of that, he would then say about this occasion when he was young and he was in a store, and they were going to the checkout, and suddenly his mother said to him, "Don't talk to the cashier. Don't say anything to the cashier. Let's just pay and we'll go. Do not talk to her." And they did that. And when they went out the store, Stephen said to his mum, "Why couldn't I talk to the cashier, Mummy?" And she said, "Because her name is Marina Oswald." Now, I'm not getting that story if I'm front loading my conversation with a load of questions. So, as I say, I'm extremely respectful to those people. And I mean, I once saw Jeff Hurst have a selfie taken with him. For anyone who doesn't know Jeff Hurst, he scored a hat-trick in the 1966 World Cup final. And one of those goals is very controversial in terms of whether it went over the line or not. And Jeff Hurst has been asked the same question every time anyone's ever met him. "Do you think it went over the line, Jeff?" And I saw him take this selfie, and he did the whole thing without looking at the person, without talking to him, because he knows that if he gives him an inch, that question's being asked. And I think when you meet people like that, I remember reading something similar about Neil Armstrong. When you meet people like that, just put yourself in their shoes for a second and wonder how you would want to be approached.
And I know what you mean about giving people space. As you've probably noticed in this interview, I haven't spoken very much at all. And I like to hear the story in that person's words. And the episodes are about them. It's not about me. I just want to hear their experiences and how they view things.
I should have warned you at the start, Ian. Once you start me on this subject, which I hope comes across in the book, I'm so passionate about it, but I never get that passion. Never becomes argumentative or Because I'm not trying to prosecute a case. I'm not trying to defend a position. I just find the subject so rich and interesting, full of coincidence, full of human nature. So I do apologize. I do I do go on at length, but hopefully that passion comes across in the book.
It absolutely does come across in the book and comes across in the interview without any doubt whatsoever. I'd be interested to know when you first stood on Dealey Plaza, what was that like? I mean, this is a subject that you have studied and studied, and then you are there, you're where it happened. What was that like for you?
It's such a good question, Ian. So the first time I went was 2012, I think. And yeah, it was a year before the 50th. And I'd always seen Dealey Plaza like, I guess, Lord of the, if like people are into like, Lord of the Rings, I saw it like kind of Mordor. It's somewhere, unimaginable in this place called Dallas, that I'll probably never go to. Um, and when I finally decided to go, and I went on my own, so I'd heard there was a conference in a Dallas that took place around the time of the assassination. And I thought, I'm just going to go, right? And I prayed to God that it's going to be okay, that I'm not going to be surrounded by kind of tinfoil hat wearing. And, I mean, Dealey Plaza is a little bit like that, particularly around the anniversary. You do get some strange people there, and you do hear some strange things. But if you know what time to go in the morning or in the evening, you can get some solitude. Now, the thing that people always say about Dealey Plaza, Ian, is that it's a lot smaller than you think, right? People always say that. But I never said that, because as soon as Google Street View was a thing, the first thing I did was walk around Dealey Plaza. And because I'd seen a Zapruder film so many times, when I got to Dealey Plaza, I thought, no, it's exactly how I thought it would be. It's not smaller or bigger. It's exactly as it is. And very little has changed. So the, Stemmons Freeway sign, which is in the Zapruder film, is no longer there. But pretty much everything else is exactly the same. The grassy knoll is still there, the picket fence. There are two white X's painted on Elm Street where Kennedy got struck. The surrounding buildings are all the same. The book depository's still there. The Dowtex building is still there. The court building is still there. It's remarkably similar. And I've been to Dallas since, quite a few times, and I often just walk around the place and just there's a chapter in the book which is called A Reunion in Dealey Plaza, where it's almost like it's like a reunion with me and those people that were there that day, because I know where they're all standing or sitting, and I walk around the place and I just think, and sometimes I if I see someone getting ripped off by a crazy tour guide, I'll step in and say, I can show you around and it won't cost you anything. And sometimes I just go down there just to just to wander around. And of course you can't help but think things like, well, if there was a planned assassination, well, where would you do it from, and stuff like that. But I would encourage anyone to go there. And one of the things I love most about it is that there's lots of people driving down Elm Street who are just getting on with their lives, that are just on their way to work, on their way home. And so it's not, even though it's very preserved, it's not like a sterile museum piece. It's still part of downtown Dallas. It's wonderful. And if anyone goes, you can reach out to me on social media. I've often done this where I've done a little Zoom call with people say, this is what you need to have a look at. This is what you need to. This is where Zapruder stood. And I, I love talking about it, and I loved visiting that place. I've become very fond of Dallas.
It's interesting, the links with Dallas, because obviously in the 70s or 80s, the Dallas, the TV show came out. And I think you do talk about this in the book, but one of the connections I found is that in Eastern Europe, Dallas was often shown on the TV show was often shown on communist TV as an example of the gluttony and greed of the West, as an example of where where you might end up. And obviously it didn't come across that way to the populations of Eastern Europe, but it has changed, from what it was in the 1960s, both politically and how people view it.
Very much so. Yeah. There was a session of Parliament which was cut short in Turkey in 1980, so that the members of Parliament could go home and find out who shot J.R. Ewing. So the interesting thing about Dallas is that it really suffered as an assassination city in a way that no other assassination city has. No one blames Memphis for Martin Luther King. No one blames New York for John Lennon. But people really blamed Dallas, and it became known as the city of hate for many years. And despite the best interests of local politicians in Dallas, it never changed the image worldwide. It became seen as a very toxic place. And of course, there's a comment that Kennedy makes on the morning of the assassination, when he's in Fort Worth, where he turns to his wife and he says, "We're headed into nut country today." Very prescient comment. So, Dallas really suffered. And it was actually the TV show, Ian, that restored the city's image. Bizarrely, by having another assassination.
Yeah.
So, when J.R. Ewing got shot, and I don't know if you remember it, but I think it was the end of season 3, but it was the final episode of that season. That entire summer, people were rewatching the footage of that again and again. It was just like the Zapruder film. People were saying, "Well, but how many shots were there? Who did he take the phone call from just before he got shot? Did he recognize? Was there an expression on his face that meant he recognized the assassin?" But of course, this time it was fun and games. It wasn't serious. And I don't know if you remember that summer, but who shot JR was everywhere.
Oh, it was.
There's a bit I talk about in a book where the Queen Mother sees Larry Hagman at Royal Ascot, and she buttonholes him and she says, "You must tell me who shot you. You must." And Larry Hagman says, "I can't. I've sworn to secrecy." Gerald Ford, who sat on the Warren Commission that investigated the Kennedy assassination and was the president after Nixon, he went even higher. He reached out to Leonard Katzman, the producer of Dallas, and he said, "You need to tell me who shot JR." And again, Leonard Katzman said, they were running, you could bet on, and I remember there was all sorts of strange bets, like, the Irish chat show host Terry Wogan was 1,000 to 1, I think. It dominated that summer, but it changed the way that people saw Dallas, because it got the worldwide population to not think about that assassination by focusing on another assassination. So it wasn't about all the infrastructure projects that the Dallas politicians tried to do. They just came up with a different assassination. And then after that, to your point about communist TV, people saw Dallas as a place of sex, shoulder pads and Stetsons. And everyone wanted to go to South Fork. And when I first started to go to Dallas, people used to say to me, "Martin, who do you think you are? J.R. Ewing." And there was a little mini chapter on this in the book. Dallas, the TV show, really did change the reputation of the city. And the city has gone on a political journey now where, Dallas, the city, voted for Harris. To imagine in 1963 that city would vote for an African-American woman is unbelievable. They voted for Biden twice, an Irish Catholic, which they had huge problems with in 63. They voted for Obama. I mean, Dallas now is a relatively progressive city. The wider state of Texas, less so, but Dallas has come on a journey, and I recommend anyone give it a chance. It's a fun place.
This podcast is brought to you by the Dallas Tourism Authority. No, only joking. Martin, thank you so much for coming on Cold War Conversations.
Thank you, Ian, for inviting me on to this podcast. I love what you do. I love this community that you have. And people have often said to me that the JFK assassination is a little bit niche, but which I disagree with, actually. And I think you've shown that this period of history isn't niche. One of the things the book is actually is a celebration of being a nerd, right? And just owning it. And being a nerd is cool, right? Having a passion about a subject is a good thing. And, people love knowledge, people love ideas. And I think what you do is fantastic. I've tried to reflect that in the book. If you're a seasoned assassination researcher, there'll be stuff in there that you don't know. But if you don't know really much about the assassination and you're looking for a sort of entry point, then it's also sort of written from that perspective too. And some of the biggest compliments I've had is people saying to me, I had no interest in this subject, or I never thought I was interested in the assassination. And then I read what you've done. So that's which pleases me, because that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to which is a gamble, obviously, but I'm trying to give this subject to a new audience.
You do it perfectly, because whilst I'm aware of the JFK assassination, I've watched the film, I have some awareness. This was coming at it from such a different angle. It was much more people-centered rather than conspiracy-centered, I would say. It was more about, how people had experienced that day, what they'd seen, the impact on their lives, but also those other people who were never found or never identified, and explaining that side of history, which we covered in the episode, talking about the Black Cat man as well. But I really enjoyed the book and learned a lot.
Great, thank you. As I said, there's loads of books out there that will tell you that Lee Harvey Oswald did it or he didn't do it. If that's what you want, this is not the book for you. I'm just more interested in stories than theories. But if you want to know all about how Dallas, the TV show, saved the city, if you want to know why this man opened up an umbrella on the day of the assassination, at the minute of the assassination, on the second of the assassination, if you want to know about that and what it says about us, then this is the book for you.
The book is called The Umbrella Man and Other Stories. You've been listening to Martin Fitzgerald. There's going to be links in the episode information for you to buy the book, and also how to contact Martin if you want to hear more. Don't miss the episode extras such as videos, photos and other content. Just look for the link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. If you'd like to help, go to coldwarconversations.com/donate. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations on Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and see you next week.